Now we are still in Module 5, where we're looking at three great salvation texts. The first of these was Romans 3, particularly verses 21 to 31. And we also explored some of chapters 1, 2, and 4 in Romans. And at the close of that first segment, we noticed that there's a seeming contradiction between Romans 4 and James 2. And we're not the first ones to notice that. Paul saying Abraham was justified apart from works, faith alone. And then James saying, come on, Abraham was justified by works. Get a life, you know. So, what's going on? James chapter 2, verses 14 to 24, James seems to be addressing a misunderstanding of Paul. What's the likely misunderstanding of Paul? Probably that there's nothing you have to do in salvation. It's free. And thereby maybe some people would start breaking the law thinking they were serving God. One possible misunderstanding would be Romans 3 verse 8. And if you're in James already, just keep your finger there. But go back briefly to Romans 3 and verse 8. He says, why not say, as we are being slanderously reported as saying, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is deserved. So Paul is accused of encouraging people to do evil in order that grace may abound. You see? If grace is big enough to cover any sin, then the more sins you sin, the more grace gets poured out. That's good, right? Yeah. So Paul is accused of having a doctrine like that. James is not necessarily, I think, attacking Paul so much as he's attacking that misunderstanding of Paul, that accusation that Paul is actually encouraging sin. He's encouraging evil. So let's get into James and try to understand what it is in fact he is saying when he uses the opposite language that Paul used. Verse 14. James 2 verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? So here he says, if a man has faith, if a man says he has faith, what does it mean to say you have faith? It's what we call profession of faith. I have faith. I claim that. That's what I would say who I am. But profession is not the same as faith. It's a faith with words. Paul is putting it this way, can workless faith save anybody? What do you mean by here, by workless faith? Keep your finger in James. Run back to Matthew 7. And if I haven't mentioned it so far, let me just mention that Matthew and James are like parallel books. They're very different in genre, but they have the same basic theology, the same emphases. Matthew 7 and verses 21 to 23. Not everyone who says to me, Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. There we're dealing with profession as well. Only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? And I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. So James is concerned that people may think that the mere expression of faith will save you. But for James, that would be workless faith. Can a man have faith that has no works? Is that even possible? Verse 15. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, "Go, I wish you well. Stay warm, find food," but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? What good is that word? What good is that greeting? What good is the well-wishing when a person needs substance? So you can see here that James is not waxing philosophical here. He's not being theoretical. He's being very practical. He's being pastoral, if you wish. In verse 15 and 16 is an illustration of workless faith. You make a statement, but you don't do anything about it. There's nothing behind it. Now the context here is back in verses 1 to 13 of James 2, where you have a rich person come into the church and they put him in the front seat, and a poor person comes, they sit over in the corner here. You don't even get a chair, you just get to sit on the floor. And James is saying, you know, what is this? This is not right. That those who need the most get the least. So he's talking about how you deal with practical settings. And to the hungry, hunger is a spiritual need. If that need isn't met, they can hardly hear you preaching. So the body really matters, according to James. It's not, spirituality is not just about the soul. The gospel has a social and a physical side as well as a spiritual side. So here he's saying, if you claim to have faith, then you ought to feed the hungry. If you claim to have faith, you ought to clothe the naked. If you claim to have faith, you ought to honor the poor as much as you honor the rich when they come into the church. You ought to treat everybody the same. These are the consequences of salvation. There's the path to salvation, but James is talking about the consequences of salvation, the way that we'll live, the way that we'll believe. Verse 17, in the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. You see, we're running into problems here, aren't we, compared to Paul. Faith alone, apart from works, is what Paul is professing in Romans. Here he says, what good is faith if there's no works? So there's a tension here in the words of James and the words of Paul. Is it a contradiction? Are they saying the opposite things? Should we not take Paul seriously if we're going to take James seriously? Or is there something deeper going on here? That's what we need to figure out. Verse 18. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. So Paul is saying here, faith by itself is dead. What he's dealing with here is how do you evaluate a claim to faith? It's a different subject than Paul. How do you evaluate a claim to faith? Someone will say, I have faith. You can have works. I'll have faith. Say, how do you evaluate that? James says, the works demonstrate the faith. You got faith, you're going to have works. No works, don't know about that faith. And now he really sticks the knife in. Verse 19. You believe that there is one God. What's that? Who's he talking to? You believe that there's one God. He's talking to Jews. What is the central doctrine of Judaism? Deuteronomy 6. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the central statement of faith. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You believe the Shema. You believe in this pillar of Judaism. All right? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. He says, you think doctrine will save you? Demons believe the same thing. They know. They don't even have to believe. They know. They know what the truth is. But they shudder about it. It's not a saving truth to them. Why is it not saving truth to them? Because they don't receive it. They believe, but they don't have saving faith. So James is working up to something here. By the way, in Deuteronomy, you have the Shema. I think it's Deuteronomy 6:4. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Then what does verse 5 say? Anybody remember? The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. That's the Shema. You can believe that God is one, but packaged with that is love Him with all your heart. What do the demons do? They believe that God is one, but they don't love Him. They shudder with terror. The demons believe in Christ, but they refuse to love His disciples, refuse to become His disciples. So the issue for James is not, do you have the truth? The issue for James is, does the truth have you? There's a difference. Often we say to a person who wants to join the church, do you believe the truth? Do you have the truth? Do you know the truth? But James would say, no. Does the truth have you? To put it another way, orthodoxy without orthopraxy is nothing. You know what orthodoxy is? That's a Greek term. Ortho means right. Orthopedics means correct foot. Right foot. Your feet are rightly aligned. Orthodoxy means right thinking. Dokeo, to think. Orthodoxy, right thinking. Orthopraxy is right doing. So for James, orthodoxy without orthopraxy is nothing. Truth that does not have you is nothing. Verse 20. You foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without works is useless? Faith without works is empty, is actually the Greek word. It's hollow. It is empty. It's a vacuum. There is a faith that goes nowhere. There is a faith that goes somewhere. There is a faith that is transformative, but there is a faith that is empty, useless. How did I put it here? Yes, useless here. Now he gets to the example. You want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Jerome.
Yeah, I was told recently that in the original, in the Hebrew, this passage with Abraham, it's a little different, in which God is begging Abraham, please offer your son. Is that true? I didn't get the chance.
I don't know.
I was told by.
What makes me...
He said, please, Abraham, will you offer?
Yeah. What makes me cautious, I'm pretty sure it would normally be translated as a command. And let's see, what is it? Is it expressed in here? Well, he just offered his son Isaac on the altar. Let's go to Genesis 22 quickly and just see how it's translated, at least. And I have a New International. What do you have? You have a King James. Okay, we have anything else?
Newest American Standard.
Okay, that's 3. Anybody got more? Let's see what we can find here. Because remember I talked about variety of translations? Will often expose problems in the original that, let's see. God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. That sounds like a command. Okay, King James. Or New American, whichever one's first. 22:2.
And it says, he said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah.
Still a command. What does the King James say?
It says, and he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I tell thee.
Still command language. What do you have?
Revised Standard Version.
New Revised, okay.
It says, he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountain.
All right, that's still command. Anybody else?
You want New English Standard, or you want the Message? What you want?
How about you have the English Standard?
Yes.
That's an excellent one.
Okay, let's do that one. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains on which I shall tell you.
Yeah, take, go, offer, that still sounds like command language. But what would, so a year ago maybe I would just respond, well, take the text as it reads. I don't see that. But a colleague of mine at Andrews University, Richard Davidson, studying the 10 Commandments, argues that the 10 Commandments aren't commands. We usually think there's 2 that are positive and 8 that are negative. He says they're not actually negative, that it's more of consequential. Because I brought you out of the land of Egypt, you will have no other gods before me. You will not worship graven images. You will not take my name in vain. You will not kill. You will not commit adultery, and so forth. I'm not Hebrew enough to know the nuances there and get into that argument. So let's leave that as an open possibility. Clearly, there's no translator that we have in this room that seems to nuance it in that way in their translation. It looks like a clear text. And I suspect it's an imperative in the Hebrew, but that in certain circumstances the imperative may, and tell us again what the nuance was.
He's saying that God asks, the Hebrew states that God asks Abraham, please, he pleaded everything, please will you take your son?
Okay. Well, I won't turn that out of hand, because people who know Hebrew better than I do seem to say that there are times when you can do that. So I'd want to hear the argument and see whether it makes sense. Those who translate the Bible at this point don't seem to be seeing it that way. But let's that probably James yeah, wouldn't be one way or the other with his argument at least. So, but that'd be interesting to explore. All right. So, verse 21 again. Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered Isaac on the altar? So here, Abraham is justified by works when he offered Isaac on the altar. And then verse 22, you see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did, and the scriptures were fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham's believing of God was a believing that generated works.
So he's saying the same thing, really.
No, not really, but he's making more sense.
Okay, Gus, you start, and then Anand, marshal your weapons, and let's listen in.
Because what he's saying is that Abraham's faith went into action. So it begins with faith. And that faith propelled him to do what he did. So it's the same thing. That's what Paul is saying.
So you'd say faith is the same thing in the two of them. Okay, Anand.
Yeah, from what I understand in Romans, if they are saying the same thing, then Abraham could boast of the works that he did. I don't know if I'm making sense, but Paul will stand against that at all, that it's something that you cannot boast. It has not much to do with works and things like that. But now James is bringing the two to bear, that all the two make sense. So if that's what it is, then Abraham could say, I could not have achieved this side without that. You know.
Why would then Paul say faith doesn't need any works, and James says it does, if they're the same?
Let me take back what I said earlier.
Well, I'm asking you. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I know. But okay, I think Paul, like you said early on, Paul is looking from the salvation side of the Christian journey.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are, Christ alone is sufficient for us, saves us. Okay? And it's by faith. We receive him and he gives us his grace, his mercy, his kindness, his goodness. Okay? That's complete. That's done with. We can't add to that. We can't modify it. We can't make it any better. It's complete. It's done. But I think James is looking from the Christian journey on the side of we continuing to journey on earth. Okay? So we don't say, I've accepted God, I am saved, and I go in a closet and hide myself. But James is saying, okay, we have this faith, we're saved, let's put it into action. Let's help the poor, let's feed the hungry, let's clothe the naked, let's take care of the sick. Let's minister to those who need ministering to. I think that's what I pick up. I might be wrong, but take a shot at it.
See,
Go ahead.
I think so. I said no.
I don't know.
So,
it's deep stuff.
See, I think it's like I can either, if I'm sick, I can work really hard at trying to be well. And I may not be well. But maybe the doctor puts an antibiotic in my mouth. And that antibiotic makes me well. It is not me making myself well. It is that what was put inside of me. And so it sounds like James is saying, when you have this gift of God, you will be doing these things. It's a natural consequence.
Right.
It is not something you do in order to get. It is something that you can't help but doing because it's like breathing. I breathe because I live. I don't know.
I like it.
So
Yeah.
I know you got to come back, so let's do it.
Yeah, so for Paulien, does that mean that he's, from what I'm understanding from here, that is he appropriating what Paul said then? See?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to hold my cards for a bit. This is a good discussion.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
like I said, I think Paul is coming from the salvific point.
You're saying that Paul and James are coming at the same issue, but from a different
Yes.
perspective,
Yes.
a different place,
Yes.
and therefore they're seeing different sides of the issue.
Yes.
Does that make any sense? Is he making any sense?
So I think
You don't think so?
I
Okay.
think Paul is like the evangelist. He's trying to get you to come to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And you are riddled in your sin, and he's beckoning you to Christ as your only salvation.
Mm-hmm.
James is saying, all right, you've been baptized, you've, accepted all the 28 fundamental beliefs, and here you are. Let's go serve the people in San Bernardino now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go feed them, let's take care of them.
I don't even hear him saying, let's go and do this or go do this. Go.
Okay.
I'm just dealing with what he's
Right.
written here. And I hear him say something like, if it were so, then you would see things like this and that and that. I don't even see him saying, go and do this, go and do that. But
So he's not commanding here. He's just saying, this is the way things are. Does that make sense to you?
Say that again.
that I hear Jim say, if you had this, then we will see something like this and that and that.
So it's a natural outgrowth.
That's something I'm getting from.
So I serve because I love. I serve because I have faith in the sacrifice of Jesus. I serve because I'm saved.
Because he said if a brother or sister comes to you naked and says he needs this, you say, oh, go and be warm
wish you
and
well.
things like that. So I what I hear him saying is that if you have faith, then these other things would
I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, like, what's the point of exegesis? Exegesis is to figure out the context of the story, and so Paul is writing Romans to Jews. Like, he's writing this letter to a bunch of legalistic Jews to be like, hey, stop it. You don't have to do anything. Stop trying to do self-righteous people. And then James says that he's writing to churches. What does it say? To the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. So then, I mean, I'm guessing this letter comes later on. So it's like, okay, I mean, what do? We get new information. We're like, this is incredible, and we go gung-ho and maybe fall off the deep end on one side. And so James is like, all right, let's come back a little bit. Like, okay, you've got that, you figured it out, but now you've gone to the opposite side, and let's find a balance. That's what I see James. I mean, it doesn't make it. It's still this text is hard for me because growing up in our church is pretty legalistic, and so I was at some church workers meetings, and I remember the pastor was like, okay, who thinks we're saved by faith, who thinks we're saved by works, who thinks we're saved by both? And it was like there was a fourth of us that were like, saved by faith, and then everyone else was like, and it was all these adults, and I was like, this is why all my friends have left the church. Right here. It was so I struggle with this James text because this is like the foundation of our church, is that you have to do stuff. So then, but it's like we need to form a balance. We need to average out from both of them or whatever. But the context of the books was Romans was to some legalistic Jews, and then this is to tribe.
So you would say Paul and James aren't sword fighting face to face. They're sword fighting back to back, facing two different
You guys
extremes.
have the left wing, and
Yes.
I've got the right
Yeah.
wing.
Yeah.
And
So they could actually be on the same team and doing the opposite things. All right. Well, let's see if that works. Okay. Let's dig a little further and see where that idea takes us. I want you to notice something here, because while both of them use Genesis 15, he's dragging Isaac in here. And Isaac is another place. All right, you see you have Genesis 15, is over here. Abraham believes. And then you have Genesis 22 is over here. Abraham works. Now, when you know the original story, you know that in between here is 40 years, roughly. I'm not sure we have it exact. But you've moved from Abraham, who was, maybe 75 years old or something at this time. And he has Isaac like 25 years later. Now Isaac is a young man. It's like 40 years. If Isaac is a teenager, it's about 40 years between these two. So this faith was saving faith. Because Abraham believed God, it was counted him as righteousness. It wasn't counted him as righteousness because he sacrificed Isaac on the altar. It's in front of him, it's not behind him. So that's not the ground. But sacrificing Isaac on the altar was evidence that this faith was genuine. So for James, there's a true faith and a false faith. So remember Paul had two ways of law, describing law, two types of justification. If you don't catch the nuance that the exegesis brings you to, and you mix those together, you can end up with terrible confusion. If you assume that faith means the same thing throughout James, you will have him contradicting Paul. So let's dig a little bit further on that. This long time between. We could put it this way. All right. We have believes here. We have faith and works. Believing and works. So in Abraham's experience, the faith and the works didn't happen at the same time. They happened 40 years apart. Or as he puts it, faith was completed by works. Or as the Greek could be nuanced, faith was brought to its goal through the works. What was the goal of faith? A transformed person. The transformation is not the basis of the faith. It's not the basis of the salvation, but it's what results, what comes out. The faith of Genesis 15 is tested in Genesis 22. If you really have faith, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Says God. Abraham struggled, but he trusted. And when he trusted, he acted out what God asked him to do. Did he command him? Did he beg him? I think that works either way. But Abraham trusted God enough to do what he said. So, then, there's two types of faith in James. And you could even say that faith has two aspects to it. You don't see this in Paul stated directly, but faith involves mental assent. You do need to say in your mind, yes, I believe this. Yes, that's where I'm going. But that's not enough. Faith has mental assent on the one hand, and then there is resulting action. And these two together make up genuine faith. It's a whole-bodied faith. It isn't a mental faith. The faith that really is genuine is a faith that's a whole-bodied faith. You believe in God, now your hands, your feet, everybody is all going in that same direction of belief in God. When we follow God, No matter how severe the circumstances, that's the fulfillment of faith. If you trust God, you will follow Him no matter what. And Abraham gets the toughest imaginable circumstance. James would probably say, we need more than straight talk. We need straight walk. Yeah. Not just to talk. You got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So that brings us to verse 24 again, which on the surface is a direct contradiction of Romans. You see. Sure.
So how does that resulting action not become a new kind of legalism?
How does it not become a new kind of legalism? Because it seems in this case to be the natural outgrowth of trust in God. The trust in God is manifested when you say, okay, He can save me. He can cover my sins. He can fill up my works with righteousness. Okay, He can do that. And then God comes along and says, sacrifice your son. Or He comes along and says, go to Zimbabwe, and preach the gospel and so on. And you say, okay. With the same trust that you accepted your salvation, you also go and carry out what God wants you to do. Yeah?
Did James exegete Paul and came up with a systematic theology?
I get the sense that James is doing his own thing here. But James is speaking pastorally to people who may have taken Paul too far, may have misunderstood. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. At face value now, verse 24 is a contradiction. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. But here we see we need to be sensitive to the biblical categories, to what the language means. If we take faith and say it's always the same thing everywhere in the Bible, if we take justification, it's always the same thing. If we take works, it's always the same thing. Then you get into these pretzels, you see. So let's dig deep into this language here and see if it can all come together. First of all, both Paul and James agree that works are necessary for the Christian. Now, James is obvious here. But if you go to Galatians 5:6, just keep your finger in James. And let's just see where Paul actually says the same things that James is saying. So we want to assure ourselves that they're not contradicting each other. Galatians 5, verse 6. Galatians 5, verse 6. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts, get this, is faith expressing itself through love. So here he's saying the natural outgrowth of faith is love. What does James say? He's not using the word love, but he's saying if you have genuine faith, you will welcome the poor person just as much as you will welcome the rich person in church. If you have faith, you will treat others with mercy. If you have faith, you will feed the hungry. If you have faith, you will clothe the naked. If you have faith, you'll sacrifice Isaac on the altar if that's what it takes. Ephesians chapter 2, just the next book over. Ephesians chapter 2. Verses 8 to 10. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so no one can boast. So there's the classic Paul. And then comes verse 10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do what? Good works. So salvation's by faith alone, not by works. And thereby we are created for good works. So Paul, in Ephesians and Galatians, is saying the same thing as James. Faith produces works. Why then do they sound so different? You've already caught, I think, the key. You didn't even need a teacher. You just needed to talk to each other. But there are different contexts here. For Paul, the context is the legalist. And the legalist lives by faithless works. For James, the context is the hypocrite who claims to have workless faith. So Paul is fighting faithless works, which is legalism. James is fighting workless faith, which is hypocrisy. I believe. Don't do anything about it, but I believe. So they are fighting back to back, not face to face. They also define their terms differently. For Paul, works are negative. They're things we do for selfish reasons to gain merit before God. So works for Paul are consistently a negative concept. They're everything that we do to undermine the gospel. For James, on the other hand, works are positive. They're works of mercy and kindness. They're things that grow out of genuine faith. They're good. So works are good for James. Works are bad for Paul. They're defining the term differently. When Paul says works, not in Ephesians, of course, but in Romans when he says works, and in these contexts where works are excluded, abolished, bad, these are works of self-exaltation, works of self-promotion, works that are done to benefit us, not others. For James, works are a beautiful outgrowth of a life that trusts in God. They define faith differently also. For James, faith is negative. You know, works are positive, faith is negative. It's shallow and narrow. It's simply mental assent. James is basically saying your definition of faith isn't good enough. It's inadequate. Mere mental assent, meaningless. Paul, on the other hand, is positive about faith. Faith is perfect trust and confidence in God. It's that wheelbarrow again, you know. If you really believe, you're going to get in the wheelbarrow. If you truly trust in God, then your whole life is into this. And if your whole life is into this, you're beginning to do things that God does because you're bonded to Him. And now you become, His walking character on earth. So if we assume that James and Paul are using the same words in exactly the same way, it's going to be a contradiction. When you see the content of those words, the biblical categories, do you see why exegesis is important? If you don't pay attention to the biblical categories, you're going to have a fight. It's not going to make sense. It's illogical. James and Paul are saying the opposite. Throw one of them out. What was Luther's choice? Toss James. He called it the epistle of straw. Just worthy to be burned up, So James didn't care. Luther didn't care for James because he seemed to contradict what Paul was saying. But he was using words differently for a different purpose. He was fighting back to back with Paul, not face to face. Let me finish it. Can you write it down? Or I don't want to lose it. Okay, but I also don't want to. I want to put this all together. Paul and James focus on different aspects of justification, just as some of you have pointed out. You came to all this, without my help. You saw clearly. Out of the conflict between the two of you, you came to the deeper truth, and that was cool to see. They focus on different aspects of justification. For Paul, the focus is on the beginning of Christian life. So he only quotes Genesis 15, which is the beginning of Abraham's faith life, or the most clear expression of that beginning at least. So for Paul, his focus in justification is the beginning of Christian life. It is that innocence before God in the heavenly court, in the heavenly judgment, that is declared upon a person who was a sinner up to that point. So Paul focuses on the moment of conversion, the moment when we transition between unrighteousness and righteousness. James, on the other hand, focuses on the ongoing justification, that being justified, that present tense, going on and on, where the good deeds are covered too. You see? So James is looking at that longer view. Paul is open to that. The tenses in Romans 3 allow that justification would be ongoing, but his primary focus is on the beginning. All have sinned, forgiven. All fall short, he's with you, right from the beginning. James now, 40 years later, is saying that justified ongoing life is demonstrated by the way that Abraham lived. So James focuses on God's continuing approval throughout the Christian life. His focus is on the process, not the beginning. So we could put that here. We have faith and works. So here we look at the beginning of Christian life, and here we look at the process. So they're taking a different standpoint in looking at the issue of justification. Paul is concerned with becoming accepted. Becoming accepted. James is concerned about living acceptably. The works of Abraham gave evidence of his faith. You could put it this way. For Paul, faith issues in works. But for James, works issues from faith. So they're just looking at it from the different angle. For Paul, faith issues in works. He's looking from the faith side toward the future. James is looking back. And works are what issues from faith. He's looking through the works back to the beginning. That faith at the beginning has brought us here where we are now. Paul, looking the other way, from that beginning point, he's looking forward. Works had nothing to do with getting you here. But he's not denying that there's going to be works moving forward. So James and Paul are a beautiful balance in the gospel. And whatever we say about working faith, we don't want to undo the beautiful gospel of Romans 3 and 4. Certainly not in the name of James. That freeness of the gospel remains. James is not taking that away. He's simply saying that once you are in Christ, it's not so much a heavy obligation, but a joy and a natural thing. Let me share with you, this is Gospel Workers. Page 161. The thought that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us, not because of any merit on our part, but as a free gift from God, is a precious thought. The enemy of God and man is not willing that this truth should be clearly presented, for he knows that if the people receive it fully, his power will be broken. If he can control minds so that doubt and unbelief and darkness shall compose the experience of those who claim to be the children of God, he can overcome them with temptation. So the key to trusting faith is to know the freeness, the giftedness, the unmeritedness of the gospel. That needs to become part of us. And the enemy, she says, is not willing that we grasp that. This is something, what we're talking about here is something that Satan will fight with everything he's got, to take it out of your mind and to distort it and make it something other than what it really is. Because when we realize that we are clean before God, that we are truly accepted, he has no power over us. Like with Luther, remember? With the inkwell and stuff. Satan had no power. Once he was free, Satan could trouble him all he wanted, and his power was broken. So this legalistic kind of a thing is something that actually enhances the power of Satan in people's lives. When we condemn and criticize, we are saying the same words as the accuser of the brethren. We're playing a satanic role. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about chaplaincy. There's not even a hint in your job description, I suspect, unless you're working in a very different place than most. There's not a hint in your job description that you have to go and condemn those patients.
Right. That's correct.
There's the recognition that how they got there is not your concern. But where they are is your concern.
Well said.
And where they are is in a condition where the righteousness of Christ can be imputed to them without any merit on their part, but as a free gift of God. And to speak the words of the enemy at that point, to discourage and confuse and torment, would be doing Satan's work. So you are not doing Satan's work when you offer the freeness of the gospel, the joy of the gospel, the confidence of the gospel, the certainty of the gospel. I'm willing to put everything up to exegesis and to the Spirit in my life. But that doesn't mean you can have confidence in nothing. These are clear texts. When you know the original, when you know the nuances, the exegesis, these are clear texts that give us the boundaries of a genuine faith. And in that knowledge is tremendous peace, tremendous confidence. And over time, perhaps, the ability to hold some things lightly that you used to cling to very tightly. Any comment?
You said to trust in faith is to trust in and you said like the merit in after you read the quote by Ellen White, I missed that.
To trust in God for salvation is also to trust in Him with whatever He asks you to do after that. And that's what we saw in Abraham. Abraham had come to trust God so much at the core of his being that when God asked him to do the impossible, he said, well, but all things are possible with God, so let me carry this out and let Him worry about the consequences. So that was the ultimate step of faith. And God, of course, didn't want him to kill his son. But it was a parable, if you wish, an acted parable of faith's trust, of how far a human being can trust in God, that he would even trust God to the point of going that far. And I don't think God would have asked Abraham that if he didn't know what the answer was going to be. Would have been a lousy example anyway. You'll see. God's not going to ask us to do what we're not capable of doing. But to those who trust that much, He wants the universe to see it. And now the universe can see the trust that Abraham had. He was the hero of faith. All right, let's take a break.